Welcome to Diversity Dish, where we're dishing on everything diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice related. My name is Sedruola Maruska, and we're bridging the gap between what needs to be said and what needs to be heard. Those individual experiences that are often ignored or simply dismissed. Sometimes I'm dining alone, sometimes I'm dining with friends, and sometimes I'm dining a la carte. No matter how I'm dining, it promises to be delicious. Let's dig in. Renowned speaker, author, and equity consultant, Dr. Nancy Dohm co-founded APOC Education in 2014 to provide leaders in education and business with accessible professional development in diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity. As an educator for nearly 3 decades, Dr. Dohm taught in the juvenile court and community schools, teaching our most vulnerable students, and has served as a distinguished teacher in residence and faculty member at California State University, San Marcos. Her transformative approach helps school districts and educational agencies throughout the country navigate complex topics, build bridges, and work together for inclusive, impactful change. Welcome back to Diversity Dish. I am so excited you came back because my guest today is Dr. Nancy Dohm. How are you, Nancy?
I am wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so happy to have you here. It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You too.
Oh, thank you. So we know that on Diversity Dish, we talk about all kinds of things related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and we can get into all of that. But usually the first question that I ask, that I'm going to ask you, leads us straight into the conversation we need to have. And that question is, what are you most passionate about right now?
Wow. Right now, I would say that my passion really lies in trying to figure out how to heal our wounds in this country, and it seems pretty lofty, like this big goal. But I really feel that it's our everyday little acts that will begin to do that. And the work that we do, a lot of our dis-ease in this country lies from our untold history, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of healing, the lack of information. And so my goal and my passion is to really kind of fill some of those gaps and inform people so that we can grow together, because this myth that we are separate and that we are not connected to each other is just that. And I think that it needs to become more mainstream understanding that we are actually dependent on our relationships together to survive.
I absolutely love that, because I absolutely think exactly that. Mm-hmm. I think that especially as a practitioner of equity and inclusion, I think all the time that there are things that if we're not facing them, if we're not looking at them, if we're not confronting them and saying, this is what happened and this is why this is the way it is today, we cannot fix the way it is today because we don't know what the root cause is. It's like going to the doctor and saying, I have this pain, and the doctor says, okay, take an Advil, without ever thinking about or looking into what the root problem of that pain is. Right. It allows it to fester, it allows it to grow, and then it allows it to take over the organism, right?
Absolutely. And that treatment, to take it to the next level, is that Advil is only treating the symptoms, but it's not getting to the root cause. So, and I think that we see that all around. We see the symptoms, we're putting Band-Aids over everything, and the Band-Aids we're not going to talk about these things. We don't want to make our kids feel uncomfortable, but that discomfort is actually what ties us to our humanity, right? Understanding that, something's got to be different. We don't want to repeat this. So.
Yes, and understanding that not repeating it means that you understand how it happened, and so now you're not going to repeat it. When we say that history repeats itself, we say that because if we are not willing to look at what happened in history, we won't learn from it.
Right.
And so we're bound to repeat it for sure.
Yeah.
So how is it that how do you uh, put this work into the world? What is it that you do?
Well, I started off as a child care worker, working with kids that were taken out of their homes from Child Protective Services, and I kind of found my way into education. And I always knew that, like education and knowledge was really truly power, especially for our marginalized groups of kids. The access. I literally remember I worked in National City, which is like South San Diego. It's right about 15 minutes from the Mexican border, and I worked in alternative ed. And I remember talking to my kids, and they have one of the most beautiful beaches in the state, less than 10 miles away, and they had never been there. Right. And so you think about, and then you got people coming in from all over the world to go to these beaches in San Diego, and the kids who live in these communities cannot be there. And that got me really thinking about access and opportunity, like, and who has it, and how do we ensure that all kids have it? So my work kind of evolved from that. And what came out of it was this protocol called compassionate dialogue, because what I realized is, if we want to see change, we have to be able to have difficult conversations. Like, because change is not easy. It's not comfortable. It's not fun, but we're looking at the end product, right? So it's just like anything. If you're an athlete, that training is going to prepare you for your performance, right? And that training is going to be super uncomfortable, but if you don't do that, you're not going to perform. And it's the same thing. Like, we have to lean into this discomfort. And what I realized was that we were really lacking the skills and the tools to do that. Too much of us taking things personally and, internalizing things, or being conflict avoidant, because, we've been conditioned that we don't talk about race. We don't talk about religion. We don't talk about politics. But, you've just named three of probably the most important things in my life. And I'm allowed to talk about those. And so the protocol was kind of hatched out of this desire to interrupt microaggressions and kind of systemic issues that perpetuate these inequities that we see. And so it started off with what we call the RIR, which is recognize, interrupt, repair. And it was just kind of a strategy to lean into that discomfort. And then probably about, 7 years after I was kind of developing the protocol, I realized that RIR without compassion could just be another bad conversation, right? And yes. So that notion of layering compassion and a desire to understand each other, even if we don't agree, and to be willing to engage, even when we think we have nothing in common, and to lean into that space to allow ourselves to be kind of wowed and mystified at what the connections we can find when we do take that risk and engage with each other. And so that kind of shifted our DEI work, and it became the pillar that all of our work kind of comes out of.
Yeah. I love everything that you said, so much of what you said, and it's just so much information there that you shared. And it's because it's so vital. When you're talking about having conversations, when you're talking about finding common ground, when you're talking about having compassion, all of these things resonate so much with me. And I hope that they resonate with those who listen also, because they're so vital. One of the reasons I started the podcast was because I wanted to have conversations where people were able to share their experiences, share what it is, what their walk is, and that so someone can listen to those conversations without having to feel as if it's directed directly at them, so that they can then kind of process the information and say, oh, this happened. I heard about this, or someone that I work with said this same thing. It's one of the reasons that this podcast exists, to have, so that to generate some conversations or even some thought around the whole thing. And when we talk about compassion is an action word. I think people don't realize that compassion it's not the same as feeling sympathy or empathy.
Right.
Compassion compels you to do something about what it is that you see.
Yeah.
And that is so important for people to understand as well. When we're asking for people to be compassionate towards others, we're asking them to see and then to help do something, be inclined to do something about what you're learning, what
Yes.
you're understanding, right? So a question that kind of came up for me in what you were talking about is, you're saying how we need to come together, we need to have these conversations, and like when we're working out, we may not like the workout, but we have to see the goal at the end. What do we do when the goal isn't seen? Like, people don't see the goal at the end,
Yeah.
but all this work still needs to be done and still needs to be, perpetuated so that we can reach the goal that some people see and one that other people do
Yeah.
not see.
That's a great question. And I think one of the things about the protocol too, people always say, well, what if the other person, doesn't do it? And I was like, well, that's the beauty of it. It's not dependent on the other person even knowing it exists, right? It's how I choose to show up in the world, right? So if I choose to show up, and even if we don't have a shared goal, but if I choose to show up with you in compassion, seeking to understand you and understand your perspective, even if I don't agree, then we can find some common ground. And that, of course, is assuming that we're relatively reasonable. I mean, I'm not talking about extreme people who are just kind of, I won't say built. I think that they've somehow been indoctrinated to hate, right? But for people, for the average kind of person who is feeling like they're divided, feeling like they got to protect themselves, but really our deep desire is to be connected. I just cannot believe that. And when you are allow yourself to be vulnerable and to kind of seek that connection, then you can open up to hearing other things. I think that we have been so kind of conditioned away from hearing things that don't resonate with us, right? And I'll take it further. So I was watching a thing, I think it was like Reagan's, I forget who he was talking to, but it was a debate, and but there was so much respect in the room. Like, and I'm not a Reagan fan, but this idea of two people with opposing views having respectful and even humorous time conversation, and then we see what it's kind of devolved to today. And now we can choose our news outlets so that we're just force fed the same message every day. And I'm not speaking just of kind of right wing. I'm talking about everybody. Like, I choose my institutions that provide me information, and so I really have to actively look elsewhere to hear a different opinion, just so that I remain open. And it's sometimes hard. I'm not saying it's easy, because sometimes the things I'm hearing, I'm like, seriously? But I feel like if I'm not willing to practice what I teach, then I'm a hypocrite, right? So this idea that we have to get used to re-normalize our ability to hear things that don't seem right to us, but in hearing that, we can seek to understand where might that come from. Because what I know for sure is that every single person has had a lived experience that has put them on the path that they're on, right?
Yes.
And my lived experience is no more valuable or important than yours. And if we can show up that way, then that means that even if we disagree, I still can respect that you've had an experience that brought you to where you are.
Absolutely. I think that it's when you talk about the mutual respect, the ability to respect someone else's opinion without devolving into you're wrong, I'm right, but
Right.
into more of I hear what you're saying, this is my view on it, and understanding that you have the right to see yours just as I have the right to see mine is so important. And yes, our lived experience, every person's lived experience is valid. I know one of the arguments is that, well, when we talk about white privilege, or when we talk about the things that people can have based on their skin color or not have based on their skin color, and someone says, well, I don't have any white privilege because I was poor and I was this and I was that. And the thing is that we're not saying that all of those things are not true, but
Mhm.
what we are saying is that there is a system in place that when you overcome those things, just as someone who is Black can overcome those same things, there's still another layer
Right.
there that you do not have to contend with, that
Right.
other people of color do have to contend with. That
Right.
is, that's just the simple as I can put it, right? And understanding, like you said, that we have we have so much more in common
Mhm.
than we don't. You
Yeah.
know, religions have so much more in common than not.
Mhm.
They all have the same underlying concepts
Mhm.
of loving each other,
Mhm.
respecting each other, caring for each other. And yet, and yet there's so much conflict, and it it blows my mind.
No, it's true. It's true. One of the things when you were talking about the idea of white privilege, and I grew up poor, one of the questions I ask, through the protocol when I hear that is like, is there any other privilege you can think of other than financial? Like growing up poor, that's one aspect of privilege, and the fact that you grew up poor doesn't, eliminate the other things that you experience, and it's not by any like choice of your own. And that's the biggest part, is we have to depersonalize that connection, so that people understand that when we're talking about white privilege, we're really talking about white opportunity. We're talking about an opportunity that is not afforded to other people who
Mhm.
don't share that thing. And so while you can be poor, there's still other privileges and opportunities that you're given, even if you're poor. And so this idea of really trying to get to the heart of it, but do it in a way where, I don't want to say do it in a way, but because I don't want to dictate the way people do it, but how do we ensure that people can hear the message, right?
Yes.
And if, to keep kind of, it's like hammering that same thing, like I'm gonna beat you over the head until you get it. Well, it just doesn't work. It just, and especially I'm stubborn, so you hit me over the head too many times, I'm dug in, and I'm gonna start, so this idea that we just have to figure out how to communicate and help each other see that, together, that kind of goal out there that says, our survival depends on us being able to collaborate.
Yes, and that is very key, right? Our survival depends on us being able to collaborate,
Yeah.
right? Because we are all on this big marble that's just floating around in space, and this is the home that we have, and this is the home that we need to protect, and we need to be able to coexist
Yeah.
with each other,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, absolutely. In the work that I do, when we're going all through the work, it never ceases to amaze me how there are how lived experience comes in, and it can blow anyone's mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? Anyone's different lived experience can blow anyone's mind. It's like, oh my gosh, I never would have thought of it that way, or I would have never seen it that way, right? And yet, people still tend to believe that everyone's life is the way that my life is,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Even when we dig into and we start to go into all of the things that happen, and you go, oh, wow, but wow, that's really interesting. So, as you do your work,
Mm-hmm.
what is the challenge? What is the biggest challenge that you've run into in doing this work?
You know, I would say that it's either fear or love, and I would say the challenge is fear, right? And the fear is of somehow there's not going to be a place for me, right? So when we talk about diversifying the workforce, we have white colleagues who are like, well, then that means I wouldn't have gotten a job, and I'm like, that's not what it's saying. But what we're saying is, how do
Mm.
we level the playing field? So for literally centuries, the white folks have had the advantage of not having to compete with the rest of the population, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, that's part of that disease, that sickness that is happening, is that now that we're starting to see more equitable practices, now instead of competing against, say 50% of the population. Now you're competing against 75% of the population. And this whole kind of, Puritan work ethic that said, if I work hard, I'm going to get this, like this somehow belongs to me, or I'm entitled to this, is part, again, of that dis-ease of the mind that says, well, I've worked hard and I was told that if I do this, I get this. Well, in the real world, that isn't how it works. It's like, I can work hard. And that was the lesson of my grandmother. So my grandmother was born 1912, Alabama, in Jim Crow. And as she was bringing us up, it was like, you're going to have to work harder. You're going to have to be smarter. You have to be more qualified, like everything she did. And she's like, and you're going to fail because people are not going to give you the opportunity. So you get your ass back up and you do it again. Right. And that was a message consistently. So the first time I apply for a job and I'm, an internal position, when I'm working in my district and I don't get it, I don't think that someone took my job. I actually was like, okay, so what do I got to do next time so that next time I get it, right? But that's a healthy approach, but if I were to turn around and say, and just be in my feelings and be pissed off about not getting this job and she took my job, well, you begin to see how that toxicity begins to develop within organizations, right? And then we begin competing against each other. And so my thing is, at the end, I could see that, this woman was the best choice for the job. And so I'm going to tap into her and see how she can mentor me so that when it's my turn, I am ready. Right. And I think that those kinds of lessons are the lessons that all of us need to have in our society, so that we understand that competition for positions is normal. There's nothing guaranteed that's yours, but we've had a history of nepotism and discrimination that have actually convinced, in general, white folks that these things belong to them and only them. Right. And that we don't belong in this space. And so, I'm laughing at the excellence and I'm laughing in a happy, joyful way. I'm seeing all these things on LinkedIn and things of, these young Black geniuses, that, getting into Yale at 12 and getting into, doing all these things. And how much genius did we lose? There was no access. And so now that we've allowed space, we start to see how people can thrive and how people of color can participate and have something to offer. And this idea, if we can get it across, that we are better together. If you have my perspective and my genius combined with your perspective and your genius, it's exponential what we can create. But this idea that you would kind of subvert a whole group of people to not participate just means that we're losing out on what's possible, right? Everyone loses out on that possibility. So that's
I love it. Absolutely. It's so true though. And I think that what you're talking about is something that, we talk about when, I guess, in the entrepreneurial world, right? It's the scarcity mindset. It's that mindset that there's not enough for everyone. And so if we allow people, marginalized people who have been held down so that we can succeed, to now succeed just like us, we're going to lose out. When in reality, what is it? It's not a pie, it's not just, there aren't limited pieces. It's just, and research tells us also that exactly what you're talking about, the working together so much better together, is really a real thing. It is a tangible, take it to the bank, literally thing.
Yes. Take it to the bank. It is. And they show organizations who have diversified, businesses that have diversified and brought in those missing perspectives and brought in other folks of color, have found that it pays at the bank. Like, actually, they make more money. They're more profitable because they have more innovation, and more creativity than they had when you've got kind of a limited perspective, right? And it's unfortunate that we have to talk about, the fiscal benefits, right? For people to actually think about why they would want to do this. But that lack mindset, that deficit mindset, that there's not enough, that scarcity mindset is really part of why we continue to remain separated. This whole thing that people are talking about now, the replacement theory, right? And that white folks are afraid to be, that they're going to be replaced and become minorities. And there's so much there to unpack, right? But the first one that I think of is like, we you can't have what is it? Discrimination if you don't have, you can't have reverse discrimination if you don't have discrimination. So we got people who won't acknowledge that discrimination exists, but they'll talk about reverse discrimination, right?
Right.
It's exactly the same thing. And so yeah, it just kind of blows my mind at our inability to think about really the larger impact and what that means. And so this idea of being replaced, you don't want to become a minority, and yet because you see yourself as separate from who we are, right?
Yes. Yes. And you really buy into this idea that the color of someone's skin is the the thing that tells you everything about them.
Yeah.
You really buy into this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's interesting to me also is that when you look at the world population,
Mm-hmm.
you look at the world population, white people are a racial minority.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
are a racial minority. If you look at the size of Africa and the number of countries and the number of people there, you look at the size of China and the number of people there, and you look at, you look at all these things and you go, they are a racial minority. And maybe in the back of their minds, they realize this and they're afraid that the majority is going to wake up to the fact that they are a majority and do unto them what they've done unto
Yeah.
other peoples.
Other people. Yeah.
But the thing is,
that is not, and that, over and over, and I know there's some folks who would have it that way, but what I truly find the majority is that folks of color, folks who have been oppressed, are not looking for revenge. They're looking for equity. They're looking
yes,
to be included. And if we could understand that it is not about getting back at you for the sins of your fathers, it's really about how do we change, the circumstances now so that we can be included and thrive. People want to just live and thrive and be able to thrive, right? But that fear, and that goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning, which is that's why the history is so important, right?
Yeah.
To understand where it's coming from and to understand, because the more knowledge you have, the more you can understand how you can repair, how you can fix this, in the future. But if you remain ignorant, then all you have is your fear. Your fear feeds you. And the fear is what we see all around us now, feeding the hate, the hate crimes, the discourse.
Mhm.
I saw this crazy video this morning of, a black man driving through a town and a white man jumps on his car hanging onto and won't let him, doesn't want him there. And literally the guy's like, get off my car. And he's just hanging on, just, and for what? Like, that's for me is the disease of racism and discrimination. And what we're seeing now is the impact on white folks.
yes.
We know the impact on people of color, but they never thought that it would have an impact on them. And this is the impact on them right now. This is one of them. I don't want to say it is the one, but that kind of, I think that mental illness, that disease, that fear, to live in fear every day. Can you imagine? Right? Like that, to just
like that, yeah.
You're going to be replaced, or you're not going to have something, or you're going to lose something. Like, could you imagine living in that fear every single day?
Yes, it really does kind of boggle the mind, and it's really about allowing yourself to look at or to hear. One of the things that I say all the time is, as we try to do this work, no one have I ever heard doing DEI work said, you are the problem. You made this happen. This is you, Martha, Betty, Bob, you did this, right? No one. It's always about saying, so let's take a look at this. Yesterday, I was having a conversation with some people, and they were saying how it's really interesting that we look at communities of color and we see a lot of cancers coming into communities of color. And then I said, well, the reason we need to, the reason that may be, and we need to look at it, is because of the corralling of people of color into certain areas. And how did that come about? That came about because of redlining. And how did redlining come about? Because the government decided that we're going to make these properties of value for white people, and we're going to use the lesser materials and things for people of color. Then when it comes time to where are we going to put the electric poles or wires, oh, we're going to put them in the marginalized communities. Oh, where are we going to put the city dump? Or, oh, well, we're going to put it over here next to the marginalized communities, because over there is not as important as over here. So now we get to today and we're going, why is there so much more, high blood pressure, this, that, and the other in the marginalized communities? Yes. If we don't look at that history, if we don't look back and see what the motivations were, if we don't look back and see how things were put into place, we don't understand what is going on now.
That's right.
And in order to be able to make a change, now we have to look at that. Yeah. Right? So you cannot stand here and say, well, it's just because, marginalized people they just eat wrong and they just do this and it's their fault and this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I do. So I train teachers. I started off training teachers primarily, and I would talk about redlining. And do you know that I would say 95% of the room had no idea what redlining was? Right. And I'm like, but you're educators and you're teaching our children. So, and this is it. So we're all products of the education system we've come from.
Yes.
Our education system has opted out of teaching the truth. Someone who recently passed away wrote a book, decades ago called The Lies My Teacher Told Me. And basically
I have that book.
Yes, it's awesome. He deconstructs like 5 top texts that are used throughout the United States for all the lies that are printed in them. So we are printing lies and teaching lies. And so the teachers are learning lies when they're in school and they're perpetuating. So we begin to see how this becomes perpetuated throughout over time, because we don't know our history. So when I talk about redlining, or when I hear someone say, well, why aren't there, you're an excellent educator. Why aren't there more Black educators? Because they're just not interested in school. And I'm like, let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education. And let's talk about what the desegregation of schools did for an entire Black teaching population that used to have jobs, because it used to be the only occupation that they could have. Right. And then you take it away because you're busing all our Black children into white schools and white communities. And so now you've destroyed an entire profession. And that was only in the 60s. And so what do you think was going to be the outcome of losing literally thousands and thousands of teachers?
Yeah.
Right. And so now we say Black people aren't interested in education, without knowing the history that says you destroyed our funnel to appropriate and effective education for Black people by taking them out. And if we had done Brown versus Board differently and actually chose to integrate instead of segregate, we would be in a very different place today.
Absolutely. And that is why it's so important. It's really interesting to me. One day I was going to do a solo podcast episode on a specific date. Mm-hmm. And I said, what would be interesting? It would be really interesting to go back in history and see some of the things that happened in history across the world. And I did a search, and everything that came back was all European Western history. Yeah. I even put in African history on this date, and very little came back. And I thought, I would have never thought that this was the case until I did the search. Yeah. And I go, so apparently there's no history in any other part of the world beyond the Western world that was valuable enough to put onto the internet. But then I thought about it, and I realized that most history in other cultures is oral, has been oral.
Mhm.
right? In the African tradition, it has been oral history that has been passed down through the ages, right? Even in Asian countries, oral history is very important, right? And so I go, so all the information that we get is shaped by Western culture, which makes it practically impossible to truly understand the whole of society.
Yeah, and so and to take that a little further, so what's interesting is that so the internet has become this thing, and we use Google, we use Yahoo, we use all this, but all these engines are white centric, so, right?
Yes,
And so
yes.
there was this and I'm shameful that I can't remember his name, but he was an amazing educator, and one of the things he did for his kids was he said, I want you to do a report on the Vietnam War, right? And so we're like, okay. And he's like, but you need to be able to talk from another perspective. So they're looking, Vietnam War, they're doing all these Google searches and they can't find any information, very similar to you. And so his whole thing was, you're looking in the wrong places. And he says you have to go to Vietnam and look at their search engines and look at their things and get them translated. And so they go and they find them the URL to do the search over there, and they still can't find anything. And he's like, well, what are you looking for? He's like, the Vietnam War. He's like, well, do you think that the Vietnamese call it the Vietnam War? And they're like, oh, so it's really a lesson on critical thinking. And so what they discover is that in Vietnam, it's called the American War of Aggression.
Mm.
Right. And so again, perspectives, for us, it's the Vietnam War. For them, it's the American War of Aggression. And so when you start looking for that using other search engines that are not kind of like our history books, stockpiled with the information that they want us to find,
Mm.
then you begin to get different information. But you have to know how, and it's not easy. And you have to know how to do it. So his whole thing was, how do I teach my students to actually look beyond what's right in front of us? So if you really want to have that information, you got to leave Google. Like you got to leave these, because all they're going to do is feed you more of the same, which is why you couldn't get a diverse answer to what happened on this day in history.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
See? And if you don't ask these questions, you don't have these conversations, you don't learn these.
Yeah. Well, and I wouldn't know. I mean, for me, I do the same thing. I'm searching. I'm like, why am I, I'm searching for, I do a Google search and I'm like, I'm trying to get some clip art and I'm like, and I you already know what I'm going to say. We do these things and it's like, model student, I'm using words and it's all white and boys.
Yes.
So you begin to see the misogyny. You begin to see, like all the sexism, the racism, yes, the discrimination of who gets to be who and what in our country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to look at it with a critical eye all the time. Like you really do have to look at it that way. Yeah, if you search for happy people,
yeah, same thing.
It seems that there are no Black, no Asian, no indigenous, no happy people of color. People of color are not happy. But if you put in something like downtrodden or something like poor or something, if you put in those words, now all of a sudden you get a confluence of color. And I go, and that's why, I think sometimes people are confused as to why we say that Black joy is part of the revolution, because you don't see it. You think that we're all miserable because we talk about the things that we need to talk about. Yeah. But the truth of the matter is that I don't see, and I say this all the time, my husband is white. Mm-hmm. And I say all the time, I've been in all white spaces, and of course I've been in all Black spaces. I'm Haitian descent. Mm-hmm. So I'm large Caribbean, mm-hmm. Community and all of that. The joy that Black people exude mm-hmm. does not exist
Yeah.
in the white community.
Yeah, no, it does not. Dr. Goldie Muhammad talks about, she's like, why do we start our Black history with slavery? She goes, we must start with excellence, with the Black excellence. Like, our history did not begin with slavery. And that point will
Yes.
always stick with me, about the stories that we choose to tell about people that keep us in this box. She's like, start with our joy, start with our excellence. We were people before we were slaves, and
Oh,
so yeah, she's powerful, and really, working in the education realm to reframe and shift that paradigm about what people believe, and that's that implicit bias piece. It's like people aren't even aware of how influenced and impacted they have been by the media that surrounds them.
yes.
Yeah,
So if you take just that small idea that we were people before we were enslaved,
yeah,
right? And you look at what was happening in those countries that were then invaded, right, by the colonizers, right? There are pyramids.
mm-hmm.
There is the Taj Mahal. There are so many amazing things there. Mathematics
Yeah,
started in that part of the world, right? Sciences
mm-hmm.
were, discovered and worked through in that part of the world. But what happens is, so now you come to the Western world, and they pilfer, they've taken, and now there's theories that the aliens came down and built the pyramids, because how could black people do it?
Yeah, yeah. It's that's that's crazy. I mean, when you think about it, but I think, when I say that, I don't say it lightly, because I think that the way we've chosen to live has been a crazy making machine, and it has, it's challenging our humanity right now. We are,
Yes.
and that ignorance is no longer bliss. It can no longer be bliss. And every day that we see mass shootings, every day that we see, just this divisive language, and this really disrespect and disregard for each other as human beings, that we can't even acknowledge the fundamental sameness of us being human beings. The fact that we can't see beyond our noses to what that impact is going to be long term is disturbing and scary.
It is. It is. I often ask the question. I always say, is the reason that you don't do something because you don't think that it impacts you? Or
Mm-hmm.
is the reason that you don't do something is because you don't think it will ever affect you? Like, you put these things, you put these rules, or you put these ideas into play, thinking, well, it's going to be just for them, it's never going to affect me. And
Mm-hmm.
then when it proliferates and it does affect you, now all of a sudden, oh my gosh, right?
Yeah,
A good example of that is the war on drugs, the drugs.
yeah,
It's a clear, first you're like, oh well, it's just those people over there, so we're gonna put them in jail. We're gonna vilify their addiction. We're gonna vilify their disease.
mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to us, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, but it's a disease, and what are we gonna do about it? And we need to do something about it.
Yes, yes. It's a very, and that's, those are the intricacies, when people are so anti, like, critical race theory right now. And I'm like, critical race theory is a theory to explain some of those phenomenon that we have been talking about, and to explain how when it's a black problem, it's a criminal offense, and when it's a white problem, it's a medical condition, right? And really understanding how race has played a role throughout history
Right.
in how we have approached issues and dealt with issues. When AIDS was a gay issue,
Mm-hmm.
no, there was not much done with it. But when it began impacting, everyone, and whether you were gay or heterosexual, all of a sudden it's impacted you. But what do they say there? There was a quote. I'm gonna butcher everything today, and I apologize. um, it's a quote loosely quoted that says, I did, when they came for them, I did nothing, and then they came for me, right? And so
Yes.
this idea that we still believe we're separate, and we still believe it's happening to them, so it's okay. But when it comes to you, and it will. I mean, and
It,
that's a
it
piece.
will.
It will, right? And so, and why do we have to get to that point? Where we have
Right.
senseless loss of any life, white life, black life, brown life.
Any life. Why do we have to get to that point? Why is it that once it begins, we don't nip it in the bud and say, oh, no, 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 this is not acceptable. And so we need to really take a look at this and do something about it now.
Right.
Clip it so
Yes.
that we can move on and say, no, we're protecting all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But we have such a long way to go for that to be the case.
Yeah.
Right?
It does. Sometimes it gets, there's days that I wake up and I'm fatigued. I'm tired.
Yes.
But I have to get up, and I think
Yes.
about my grandmother, 1912, and, and our ancestors before her, and everything she did so that, my sister and I were the first to go to college in my family and our family. And, the sacrifices that they made so that we could be here. So I don't get to be tired, and if I am, I don't get to stay tired. Let's put it that way.
We don't get to stay tired.
I can be tired, but I don't get to stay tired. So
Yes. Yeah. And, and there's sometimes, that I think, oh, what good does this do? Right? What good does my little tiny voice do? And then I have to get out of that mind space and I have to say, well, if we all took our little tiny voices and put them together, then something is happening. And I feel that something is brewing, something is happening, right?
I have to believe it. You know what?
Yes.
There's a way for me to move forward. So I have to believe that, and I have to believe that I can be a part of that solution. I'm not the solution for sure, but I'm definitely going to be a part of it because it is my passion. It is my work. So
yeah. And we have to be a part of it together, right? For me, I'm constantly looking to amplify voices like yours and amplify voices of others who are doing something. Even if I feel like they're saying the same things that I say, I'm like, you know what? Somebody's going to resonate with their voice and someone's going to resonate with my voice. Therefore, we just need the voices. We need as many voices as possible to say this is what's happening, and we really need more people to understand that this is what's happening and why it's happening and how we can move forward, right? And like you said, we move forward with having conversations, going through the hard things and using compassion along the way so that we are all aware of our humanity and that we're doing this for humanity, right? Mm-hmm. We're doing it for humanity. And we can't leave any part of that humanity behind if that's what we're doing for.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
We can't leave any of it behind. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we haven't talked about today? I think we've talked about a lot.
We've talked about a lot. I mean, it's been a wonderful conversation, I just like to leave with that. I think, like you said, going back to this notion of compassion and, the protocol I created was really a tool, not the tool, right? But a tool to really help us start to connect with one another. And we have to get beyond the color line. We have to look at each other and see each other as whole and complete and perfect exactly as we are, right?
Yeah.
And find that common ground, that similarity, and build off that instead of what we perceive to be different about each other.
Yes, absolutely. And just to be very clear, because some people might take that wrong, we're not saying that we don't see color. No. What we're saying is that we see people for exactly who they are and what their lived experiences are. And that is different for each person.
Absolutely.
And so we have to see that.
Yeah. And when I meant the color line, I mean, I think that we just look at color and we separate,
Yes.
I'm just and so I'm saying is that getting beyond that color line and saying that we all, and
yes.
so on. And so thank you for pointing that out, because there is no color.
You know too.
Believe me, fully aware. There is no color blindness, and we're not even pushing that. The idea is that we want to see color, but we have to redefine what it means that when I see you as a Black woman, that isn't somehow that your deficit. I don't somehow come to you as less than. So we have to change our definition of white, of Black, of of Latino, of what of everything, and really allow people like to just show up whole and perfect as they are, and change those definitions. But I want you to see my Blackness, and I want to see whiteness, but the whiteness is not the whiteness of the white privilegedness. It's the whiteness of what you bring and the history that comes with you and your family in that way, and acknowledging that, as opposed to every time we won't even say these words because they have a negative connotation to them, because we haven't evolved them, right, to really let them be like, it is a descriptor. It's a physical descriptor. It is not a definer.
Yes, absolutely. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. And it's before I let you go, we need to end on the note of what, Nancy, is your favorite dish?
All right, so it's not going to be a dish. Well, can I give you two, Sadie? Because here, my favorite meal will always be sushi, right? And I mean, like, it's got to be, right? Because
every day.
It could be every day. But my favorite dish will bring me back to my grandma, and it's about comfort, and so it's got to be peach cobbler.
I love peach cobbler.
I smell peach cobbler, and it just takes me home. It takes me to my family. So if I have to think of a dish, it would be that's family to me, right? That's home, that's comfort. But if I'm saying meal, it's got to be sushi.
I love it. I love them both. I'll have them both with you.
And together, we can start with sushi and finish with the cobbler.
That's right. Exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Nancy Doan, for being here on Diversity Dish. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our time.
Hey, did you enjoy that episode? If so, please leave a review. It would mean the world, but only if it's a good one and you really did enjoy it. In which case, it would be awesome if you help support my work over at patreon.com/Sedruola Maruska. And finally, before you go, don't forget diversitydish.com. I'd love to work with you. See you soon.